On this end of the boardwalk, I'm joined by former attorney, human rights activist, and inclusive designer Elise Roy. Elise, thanks for coming to IO Live.
Thanks for having me here.
For those that don't know your backstory, you lost your hearing at age 10.
I did.
Which is why we're going to be using Google's Live Transcribe app to make our conversation happen in real time. Can you tell us what it means to be an inclusive designer?
Absolutely. So, an inclusive designer is someone that helps organizations solve problems from the perspective of people with disabilities or difference. It's based on this human-centered design tenet that when we solve for extremes, we often develop better solutions than when we solve for average. And that might seem kind of counterintuitive because the greatest number of people tend to hover around average. But the problem is that no one actually is average. And so when we solve for average, then, and people are a little bit over here, a little bit there, there's this gap between what we create and what their needs are that we're not meeting. If instead we solve for those extremes, then we've already covered that gap. And we've created something that's a lot more adaptable and a lot more innovative.
That makes so much sense to me. And it reminds me of something else that you've talked about, which is human-centered design. Can you define that term for us as well?
Sure. So human-centered design is a philosophy and a methodology for problem solving. It's based on a lot of things that we've taken from the design realm, and it can be applied to almost every realm you could imagine, from international development to policy to the sciences to technology. And what differentiates it is its almost obsessive focus on designing around the human that we're trying to reach. So in the past, a lot of times we think that when we're trying to solve a problem, we want to get all the experts into this room and have them figure out how to solve it. The problem with that is they have one point of view, their own. So if, for example, there are a bunch of developers, they're probably going to create something that's very complex, and most of us don't, the so-called average people don't really understand. If instead we focus our process on the people we're trying to reach, then we develop something that fits their needs much better.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of empathy involved where you're trying to understand what their needs are. You're following them around in real-life situations. You want to make sure that you're also answering the right problem. So many people are answering the wrong problem.
Yeah.
And then there's ideation, which is similar to brainstorming, but we use a lot of design methods to really get people thinking outside the box. It's a lot more powerful. We want people to throw out crazy ideas. We want as many as they can think of. And then we prototype, which is a lo-fi solution that we know we're going to mess up with, but that's the purpose of it, is to fail and to learn from it. And then the last step is to implement it and make sure that it's sustainable.
I love this idea of having practices and mechanisms for helping experts get out of their perspective. Because when you bring an expert in the room, you're asking them to give their expert opinion, not their general opinion. And that's so focused most of the time, right?
Exactly. And that's also why I love inclusive design, because that brings people even further outside of their tunnel vision.
I see. This reminds me of another quote of yours, if I may. You said, when we look for gaps of exclusion, we identify opportunities for great change. And I find this really inspiring. Do you have some examples that you can share where you see this really clearly?
Definitely. I can give you some Google-centric examples. So, Google's chief internet evangelist, Vint Cerf, he created email for his deaf wife. And as you know, that's become a huge thing that everyone loves. But he didn't see it as something that would be applied to everyone initially. And most people didn't think of it in that way at first because we had the capabilities to talk to people on the phone. And that was the way that business was run. But slowly we realized that people also have this desire to not have to keep talking to someone on the phone. And they want to, say something real quick and be done with it. And sometimes we also have this desire to formulate our thoughts before we communicate with someone. And email filled those hidden desires. Another example is YouTube. They inserted closed captioning capabilities into their media player, which was really amazing at the time. And closed captioning was originally created for the deaf so that they could follow along. But what YouTube realized was that if a video has closed captioning capabilities, then the likelihood of it being watched to the end was increased by 80%.
Wow.
Yes.
Is that because there's so many situations where you have the sound off?
Exactly.
Okay.
So the reason why designing for inclusion works is because we find ourselves as we go about our lives in these momentary situations where we have a momentary disability. So we might be carrying something and we lose the use of our arms. If we're in a bar, closed captioning is helpful because we can't hear. And if we are in our office and we want to sneak in a Facebook video, closed captioning is helpful. So.
That's awesome. Those are really great examples, and I love how it's really connecting this idea of designing for the extremes, and then it becomes more usable for everyone.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's really great. Elise, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your gifts and your insights. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.